Mr. President, today we're going to remember the victims and families whose lives were forever changed by the bombing in Oklahoma City 21 years ago. This terrorist attack, homegrown terrorism, the bombing shook our nation to its core. In fact, it remains the worst act of homegrown terrorism our nation has endured. The destruction and the loss of life were overwhelming. This photograph I've never forgotten. It's a firefighter carrying the limp and bloody body of a toddler from the wreckage. Those of us who are parents and grandparents know the joy we've had in carrying children that age. You can only imagine the sadness of that firefighter. It symbolized the horror of the attack. 168 innocent lives perished that day. 19 of them were children. The impact, of course, of the loss in Oklahoma City community was enormous. The city's emergency services, their victim support resources were quickly overwhelmed. As the days went by and the needs mounted, it became clear that the existing state and federal resources were simply insufficient to respond to such a massive attack. So to respond to the victims' needs, I proposed, and Congress passed, the Victims of Terrorism Act of 1995. Among important matters, the legislation I wrote created an emergency reserve to serve as a resource in the wake of an act of terrorism or mass violence, even though every one of us, Republicans and Democrats alike, prayed there'd never be another such act. We had in my legislation an emergency reserve. Because without such a fund, state victim assistance programs are quickly overwhelmed. And this new fund was critical in ensuring that additional resources got to the field quickly. And last month, I met with a former federal prosecutor who managed the investigation and the prosecution of the Oklahoma City bombers. And we talked about the prosecution. That former prosecutor is now Chief Judge Merrick Garland. He was nominated to the Supreme Court last month. But before he was a judge and a nominee to serve in the highest court in the land, he was a prosecutor and a senior official at the Justice Department. Now, those of us who've had the privilege of being prosecutors, none of us have ever faced what he did. And immediately after hearing the news of the devastation in Oklahoma City, Merrick Garland turned to the Deputy Attorney General. He said very simply, "You need to send me there." And the next day, Merrick Garland became the highest-ranking Department of Justice official on the ground in Oklahoma City after the bombing. He helped to oversee every aspect of the criminal investigation and the response. And years later, he still considers his work in Oklahoma City the most important in his life. Chief Judge Garland's commitment to fairness during that difficult period, his work with the citizens of Oklahoma City, was formative for him. And I know, in talking with him, that it left a lasting impression on him, but it left especially a lasting impression on the people he served. Last year, the Oklahoma City National Memorial and Museum honored Merrick Garland with a Reflections of Hope Award for his work on behalf of victims. And after his nomination to the Supreme Court last month, the Oklahoma Museum's executive director said, "We are so proud that Judge Garland, who kept the family members and survivors front and center during his work in Oklahoma City, has been nominated." We've also heard from a team of former prosecutors, law enforcement agents, victims advocates. They worked directly with Chief Judge Garland. In the aftermath of the Oklahoma City bombing, they've written to highlight Chief Judge Garland's work in this terrorism case and to strongly support his nomination to the Supreme Court. And the law enforcement team writes of Chief Judge Garland, 20 years ago, the nation could not find a better lawyer to manage the investigation and prosecution of what was the worst crime ever committed on American soil. Today, our nation could not find a better judge nor a more honorable man to join the highest court. And I ask consent that letter be included as part of the record.
Without objection.
The American people know that it is this dedicated public servant who is now being denied a public hearing by Senate Republicans. No nominee to the Supreme Court has ever been treated the way Senate Republicans are treating Chief Judge Garland. Since public confirmation hearings began in 1916, the Senate has never denied a Supreme Court nominee a hearing and a vote. And I'd say to my friends, the Republicans, you have no good reason for your obstruction of Merrick Garland. Americans, by a 2-to-1 margin, want Chief Judge Garland to have a public hearing in the Judiciary Committee. Based on more than 4 decades of precedent, that hearing should take place in the Judiciary Committee next week. Instead, Senate Republicans continue to ignore the American people. Neil Siegel, the law professor at Duke University, has pointed out it does not matter constitutionally, nor is it a matter of tradition, whether a nomination is made in an election year. Numerous nominations have succeeded during election years. Without exaggeration, Senate Republicans have made up a distinction without a relevant constitutional difference. Now, even school children know that presidents are elected to 4-year terms, and they have to carry out their constitutional duties each and every year, right up until noon of January 20th of their last year. And it's no different for we senators. We can't just sit this year out because the election will be held in November. Today, as we remember the victims, their families, and the entire Oklahoma City community, let's also remember the good that the Senate has done when we put aside destructive partisanship and come together to act for the good of the country. This body has done that time and again under both Democratic and Republican leadership, and has carried out its constitutional duty to consider nominees to the Supreme Court. So I hope the Senate will carry out that duty for a public servant named Merrick Garland, who has served his country so well.